In my last video, I looked at a particular line of the exchange variation of the Queen's Gambit declined in a game between Boris Golko and Nigel Short. I'll put a link to that video in the description, but I want to look at a more recent, more modern game in the same line. So let's look at the game Carlsen versus Kramnik, which was played in the Norway Chess tournament in 2016. Carlsen, we all know, is the world champion, and he's been the world chess champion since 2013. Now, Kramnik was also world champion. He was world champion from 2000 to 2006, so this is the clash of the world champions. Kramnik did recently retire from professional chess in 2019, and he does spend his time promoting chess and teaching chess to children. But let's take a look at this game. Carlsen had the white pieces, and I want to contrast this game with the Golko Short game. So they played a Queen's Gambit directly, and Carlsen played the exchange variation. Bishop g5 is the normal move, and I mentioned bishop e7 here is the main line, but c6 is a good alternative, and that's what Kramnik played, just like Nigel Short. Now e3 is one way to meet the coming bishop to f5 with the intention of playing queen to f3. So his bishop falls back, and Carlsen takes the knight to ruin the pawn structure there. So this is exactly how the Golko Short game from 1994 went. But we're going to see a different plan by Carlsen. Carlsen's very creative and comes up with quite unique middle game plans. We mentioned the importance of this f5 square. White would like to occupy that and control that square. It's a very good outpost for a knight since it can't be driven away by a pawn. We also mentioned black would like to put a knight on d6 to help defend that square. d6 is an excellent square for a black knight, which might come to c4 or e4. Let's see how Carlsen handles this f5 square. So he plays knight f3. So right away committing his knight to f3, not making use of the e2 square. Knight d7. Knight h4, attacking the bishop. It's not really a threat to take it though. White doesn't want to take the bishop and straighten out the pawn structure. But the knight does influence the f5 square here. Okay, bishop e7, knight e2. He's bringing his queen's knight over to the king's side as well. Let's see why. Knight b6. Black is inching closer to that d6 square. Knight g3. Now we see both knights are pointed at f5. So that does allow Carlsen to occupy f5 with a knight. So a very interesting plan. Okay. If you recall in my last video, Boris Golko's plan was to put the king on d2, supporting bishop to d3, and the bishop was used to control f5, and he left his queen's knight on the queen side. But you might also recall from that game that Golko's queen's knight just sat on f3 doing nothing in the game until it got traded off. Okay? And Carlsen is making use of both knights here, pointing them at f5. Bishop b4 check. Carlsen allowed that. He doesn't need to castle in this position. It's not an open position and the queens are off the board. Knight a4, attacking b2. Carlsen ignores it and occupies f5. It's not really a good idea to take this pawn because king to c2 comes, and then either the knight can come here and get taken by the bishop, or it can come here and white can fork the minor pieces. Although black can attack the rook with the bishop, but the rook can sidestep that and attack the bishop back, and white can get two pieces here for his rook. If the knight falls back to c4, then white can capture it, black has to recapture, and white can attack that bishop with his h rook. He wants to keep the a rook where it is to support an a3 pawn push. So if this bishop moves away, then the b7 pawn falls. If black protects the bishop, then a3 comes and it has to move away anyway, and the b7 pawn falls. So this is why Carlsen ignores the threat on his b2 pawn and simply places one of his knights on f5. So that bishop is blocked out of the game. It's under control, and f5 has been occupied. So Carlsen's strategy looks quite good. King to d7, rook to b1, now he does defend the pawn. King to e6, okay, that attacks f5 twice now, once with the bishop, once with the king. So bishop to d3 protects it. Okay, so f5 is well under control. Rook h c8, perhaps intending to play c5 and open the c file. King to e2, connecting the rooks. Bishop to f8. g4 puts further control on f5. This is the centerpiece of Carlsen's game, is the f5 square. c5. Knight g2. So with the pawn on g4, overprotecting f5, that did release Carlsen's h knight to get into the game somewhere else. And right now it can come to f4, an excellent square. Okay, so black opens the c file and then plays bishop d6, guarding the knight from coming into f4. h4, so now Carlsen's plan is just to push the h-pawn. So it's coming to h5 next. And it's a threat because if black makes a non-move here and attacks that bishop, it would have to trade off. Carlsen would take back with the bishop and skewer the rook on c8. So black has to deal with that threat, and he plays h5 to stop the h-pawn. Okay, but this probably was a mistake. I'm not sure what the better move was, but it does allow knight to g7 check, and now the h5 pawn falls. Perhaps Kramnik wanted to let that happen, reasoning he can stop these h-pawns, which are, on the same file. So bishop comes to, bishop trades the bishop on d3, king takes d3, king to d7, knight to e3 attacking the d-pawn, knight to b6 defending it, knight to g4 attacking the f6 pawn, rook to h8, trying to stop the pawns from advancing on the h file, rook h e1, okay, he can take this pawn at any time, it's not going anywhere, and this rook does cut the king off from the king side. Bishop e7, knight f5, bishop d8. He pushes that h-pawn. That's his priority here. Rook to c8, b3, nice prophylactic move, keeping the knight out. Okay, rook to c6 laterally defends this pawn. Knight g e3, okay, putting further pressure on d5, protecting the knight. Bishop to c7, rook bc1 challenging the rook. Rooks get traded. Bishop to f4, trying to actively do something with his bishop, and also attack that h-pawn. So rook c5 attacks the e-pawn. So Carlsen is signaling he's willing to give up one of his two h-pawns. Can't queen them both. So king to e6 to protect d5. Knight g7 check, king d5, knight g4 attacking f6 and protecting h6. Okay, the knight attacks the rook, it falls back to c2, f5 attacks the knight. Okay, it's a pawn sacrifice. King to e6, knight to g7 check, king goes back, rook to e2, king c6, and the rook challenges the rook in the corner. There's not much Kramnik can do at this point. He's losing the game. He has to trade rooks, and now there's a clear path for Carlsen to queen one of his h-pawns. Knight to f8 to stop the pawn from getting to h7. Check. Okay, trades minor pieces. King comes in to attack the knight. Check. King to e6. Pushes his h-pawn, giving up e5. He takes it. Check, forking the king and the knight. So that pawn was immune because of this fork. Can't take the knight, but Kramnik does anyway and allows the pawn to queen, and the game ends. So Kramnik resigned. So I didn't analyze that in any detail. I just really wanted to look at the opening plan of Carlsen here. Let's take a look at that again. So Carlsen takes advantage of the f5 square by bringing both of his knights to bear on it. Let's see how he does that again. There, both knights are attacking f5 at that point. Okay, excellent game, and Carlsen went on to win that tournament. Thanks for watching.